Think about the last online course you took. Remember how excited you were while watching it? You took notes, maybe you even highlighted the important parts. But let me ask you something. How much of it do you actually remember now? If you're being honest with yourself, probably not much. And here's the thing. You're not lazy. You're not bad at learning. Your brain is literally designed to forget. And once you understand why, you can finally do something about it. Today, we're uncovering the science behind forgetting. And more importantly, the simple changes that can completely transform how much you remember. Let's dive in.
Back in the 1880s, a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus conducted an experiment on himself. He memorized lists of nonsense syllables and tested how much he could recall over time. What he discovered was shocking. Within just 1 hour, he had forgotten 50% of what he learned. By the end of the first day, nearly 70% was gone. Within a month, only about 20% remained. But here's what's really fascinating. This wasn't a failure of memory. It was a fundamental feature of how human brains work. Think about it this way. Your brain receives millions of pieces of information every single day. Every sight, every sound, every thought. If your brain tried to hold on to 90% of all that information, you'd be completely overwhelmed. You wouldn't be able to function. Forgetting isn't a bug. It's a feature. It's your brain's way of clearing out the noise and keeping what matters most. But that's also the problem. When you actually want to remember something, your brain often treats it like optional noise. So why does this happen? Scientists have identified several major reasons why your brain lets information go. First, weak initial encoding. When you passively read or listen to something, you're not truly engaging with it. Your brain basically says, this isn't important enough to store. Have you ever finished reading an entire page and immediately realized you have no idea what you just read? That's weak encoding. The information never went through deep processing. Second, lack of retrieval practice. Here's something most people get wrong. Simply reviewing information doesn't permanently embed it. Think back to cramming for exams. You read your notes over and over again. You felt confident, you passed the test. And then, 2 weeks later, everything was gone. Why? Because you never practiced retrieving the information from memory. You only reviewed it on the surface. Third, interference. New learning can interfere with old learning. Scientists call this proactive and retroactive interference. When you learn something new, it can overwrite or block access to similar information you already knew. Have you ever learned a new phone number and suddenly struggled to remember the old one? That's interference at work. Fourth, decay over time. Without use, neural connections weaken. Neurotransmitters stop firing along those pathways as often. It's like an unused muscle. It slowly loses strength. If you don't regularly retrieve a memory, the neural pathways supporting it gradually degrade. But here's the encouraging part. All of these causes are preventable. Your forgetting isn't inevitable. It's often the result of learning in ways that don't match how your brain actually works. So, what actually works? The research is surprisingly clear. Strategy 1: spacing and repetition. Ebbinghaus discovered something else in his experiments. Spacing out your learning dramatically changes the forgetting curve. Instead of cramming everything into one session, review the material 24 hours later, then again after 3 days, then after 1 week. The forgetting curve begins to flatten, and you retain much more information. This is called the spacing effect, and it's one of the most reliable findings in all of psychology. Your action step:
Review what you learn within 24 hours. Review it again after 3 days. Then after 1 week. After 1 month, you could retain 80 to 90% of the material instead of only 20%. Strategy 2. Active recall over passive review. Don't just reread your notes. Test yourself. Close the book. Ask yourself what you remember. Try to explain the ideas without looking. This forces your brain to retrieve information, and every retrieval strengthens the neural pathways involved. Research shows that active recall produces around 50% better retention than passive review. That's a massive difference. Strategy 3. Elaboration. Connect new information to what you already know. Your brain loves connections. Whenever you learn something new, ask yourself, how does this relate to what I already understand? Use metaphors. Turn concepts into stories. Teach the idea to someone else. When you elaborate, you're not storing isolated facts. You're integrating information into a rich network of existing knowledge, and that network is much easier to access later. Strategy 4. Chunking. Your working memory can only hold about 7 pieces of information at once. But when you group related information together, you expand what you can manage. For example, a phone number isn't 10 separate digits. It's organized into chunks. That makes it much easier to remember. Look for patterns. Organize ideas into meaningful groups. This simple strategy can dramatically improve retention. Strategy 5. Sleep. Seriously, sleep is where the magic happens. During sleep, your brain consolidates memories. It transfers information from short-term storage into long-term storage. Neurotransmitters recalibrate. Neural connections strengthen. If you're trying to learn something while consistently sacrificing sleep, you're fighting against your own biology. Here's what's fascinating. Ebbinghaus published this research in 1885. We've known about the forgetting curve for nearly 140 years. Yet, most students still cram the night before exams. Most people still rely on passive reading. Most learners are still fighting against the way their brains naturally function. You don't have to be one of them. The science is clear. If you space your learning, actively recall information, elaborate on new ideas, chunk related concepts, and prioritize sleep, you won't forget 90% anymore. You'll retain far more of what you learn. Maybe 80%, 85%, even 90%. Now, I want to hear from you. What's the biggest challenge you face when trying to remember what you learn? Is it information overload, not enough time to review, difficulty staying motivated? Leave your answer in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.